The air reeked of swamp rot and concrete dust as I stood at the edge of what used to be my backyard, watching Karen from the HOA yell at a city inspector while her oversized pre-due thousands McMansion sank another inch into the muck. Flash flood warnings wailed from squad cars parked nearby. Frogs croaked from submerged front lawns. Across the soggy expanse, a rusted mailbox drifted past like a funeral barge. Yeah, that's me. You're probably wondering how things ended up like this. I never imagined that the skinny little creek running behind my house would become the front line in an all-out war. But that's exactly what happened. For years, that trickle of water had been my escape, my reward after long days spent welding pipes and crawling under houses. I'd unwind in a beat-up folding chair by the creek with a beer in one hand and a fishing pole in the other, though the only thing I ever caught was the occasional curious bluegill. Dragonflies buzzed through. The tall reeds the air smelled like damp grass. And at night, the soft burble of water threading through rocks was the only sound. It was peace, the kind you don't mess with. Then came the HOA. Technically, they'd been over on the other side of the development for years, tucked away in their cookie-cutter beige houses with matching mailboxes and eerily synchronized Halloween decorations. Every October, we on the creek side were the old-timers, the holdouts from when this place was all fields and dirt roads. But boundaries shifted, neighborhoods got absorbed, and before we knew it, the HOA had oozed into our lives like a slow-moving oil spill. My first run-in came one sticky Saturday morning when a woman named Karen Mitchell knocked on my door, gripping a clipboard like it was a weapon. She was dressed in pastel workout clothes she clearly hadn't sweated in, and her smile had all the charm of a tax audit. She introduced herself as the Community Standards Chair. I told her I was busy. That didn't stop her. She had complaints about my property, sure, but mostly about the creek. According to her, it was an unauthorized water feature and a potential hazard to children and wildlife. I looked at her like she'd just accused my cat of running a Ponzi scheme. The creek wasn't some man-made koi pond or backyard gimmick. It had been here long before any of us showed up with our mortgages and zero-turn mowers. It belonged to the land just like the trees and the rocks. But Karen didn't care. Karen had rules about fencing off water features, rules about standing water, rules about appearances, rules on top of rules. I calmly pointed out that the creek was a protected natural drainage listed in my deed and backed by county regulations, but she just scrawled something onto her clipboard with fury and stomped off, leaving behind a cloud of overpriced perfume and raw indignation. 2 days later, I found a violation notice taped to my door with blue painter's tape. It claimed I had unauthorized landscaping, unsafe open water, and, most absurdly, was attracting non-native species because, apparently, frogs had become an invasive threat. I ignored it. A week later, I got a second notice, this time threatening fines of $100 a day unless I submitted a plan to bring my property into compliance. I sent back a short letter quoting relevant county ordinances and included a copy of my land survey confirming the creek's legal status. Their response? A mandatory inspection. That so-called inspection consisted of 3 strangers prowling around my backyard with tape measures and smartphones, snapping photos like they were gathering evidence for an environmental tribunal. Karen stood at the edge of my property, arms crossed and foot-tapping, glaring like she was waiting for me to break into song and confess my crimes. I stood with my own arms crossed, daring them to set even a toe in the creek. They didn't, but they wrote down plenty. A week later, at the mandatory HOA meeting I had zero intention of attending until then, Karen stood up before a room of mostly bored neighbors and declared my creek an imminent safety hazard. She rattled off phrases like insurance liability, wildlife nuisance, mosquito breeding zone, and erosion risk, all while ignoring the fact that her own backyard was steadily dissolving into a swamp. The irony was apparently lost on her. When I got up to challenge her claims, she flashed that fake sweet smile and handed me a thick packet of documents demanding that I either fence in the entire creek, fill it, or agree to weekly HOA inspections for a full year, on my dime. Aye, politely informed her, and the entire room exactly where she could stick her paperwork. That's when things really started to spiral. The anonymous complaints started piling up like junk mail. Notes accusing me of neglecting my yard, of violating property standards, of letting things go wild. Every other day, there'd be another passive-aggressive message stuck to my door. Then my mailbox got knocked off its post like someone had taken a baseball bat to it in the middle of the night. One morning, I found a heap of landscaping rocks, dumped right into the shallow end of the creek, backing up the water just enough to cause erosion along the banks. And then there was Karen sitting in her SUV across the street with the engine running, snapping pictures through the window like some wannabe suburban PI. I didn't flinch. I kept the creek natural, trimmed the reeds, made sure the flow stayed. Clear, it was my land, my water, and my right to sit beside it in peace. But I should have known they wouldn't stop there. It happened on a Wednesday morning. I was out on the back porch, sipping coffee and watching the mist lift off the grass when I heard a low rumble in the distance. At first, I figured it was the city finally getting around to fixing the pothole up on Maple Drive. But the noise grew louder, closer. I stood up and saw a small cement truck backing carefully down the alley beside my house. A guy in a neon vest and hard hat was guiding it like it was a precision instrument, shouting instructions to the driver over the engine's growl. I bolted off the porch, sprinting across the yard as they lined up the chute right over the upper bend of the creek. "Hey!" I yelled, waving my arms. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The guy in the vest barely looked at me. "Just following work orders, sir. Drainage mitigation project approved by the HOA." Before I could argue, the chute swung down and thick gray concrete started gushing out, heavy and slow. I lost it. I rushed forward but slipped in the muddy grass, crashing to the ground and scraping my arm. By the time I got back on my feet, the damage had already begun. The slurry oozed into the creek like poison, coating stones, drowning plants, killing everything in its path. Frogs leapt from the water, some managing to escape, others caught and frozen mid-jump as the concrete spread and hardened. The driver kept the drum spinning, steadily filling the entire upper bend of the creek with thick gray sludge, as if he were topping off a pothole. The guy in the vest just nodded, satisfied, checking his clipboard like this was just another item on a to-do list. I yelled at them to stop, demanded they show paperwork, told them they were trespassing, but they didn't even flinch. By the time they finished and rolled out, what had once been my sanctuary was nothing more than a dead concrete trench, stretching across the yard like a scar carved into the earth. I stood there, dripping with mud and blood, heart pounding, staring at the wreckage of what had been the soul of my home. And there she was, Karen, watching from the sidewalk, arms folded smugly across her chest, grinning like she'd just checkmated. Me in a game I never agreed to play. I wiped the mud from my face, stood tall, and smiled right back. She could have this round. She didn't know what she'd just started. The first real rain came as a kind of relief after the blistering summer. A thick gray curtain rolled in from the west, soaking the scorched pavement and turning our dried-out lawns into muddy sponges. I sat on the porch, coffee cooling in my hands, arms crossed, and watched the downpour pound the roof in rhythmic bursts. Any other year, the creek would have handled the runoff without breaking a sweat. Its winding path would drink the water, pull it downstream, and quietly vanish, it from view. But now there was nothing to absorb the flood, just a concrete ditch, hard, lifeless, and useless. I watched the rain hit the channel, swirl aimlessly, then begin to pool, spreading across the lawn and into the low spots, sluggish and confused like it had forgotten where it was supposed to go. Within an hour, puddles were gathering across my backyard, dark and bloated like bruises. By noon, the sidewalk out front was submerged in ankle-deep runoff, bits of mulch and trash swirling in clogged whirlpools around the storm drains. Across the street, Karen stood under an umbrella so large it could have doubled as a beach tent, watching with tight-lipped satisfaction as the water crept up to curbs and flower beds. But it didn't stop there. After just 2 storms, the real problems began to show. Mrs. Jensen, who lived on the corner, stepped out of bed one morning and felt the carpet squish beneath her feet. Her basement flooded. Mr. Beasley's backyard turned into a swamp, and his shed started tilting like a drunk on a Friday night. Alvarez had to stack sandbags across his front stoop after runoff turned the slope of his yard into a fast-moving stream. Up on Maple Drive, the gutters choked and overflowed until the whole cul-de-sac became a stagnant pool, trapping 2 unlucky sedans in wheel-well-deep brown water. And every time, without fail, the HOA blamed the homeowners: improper lawn grading, clogged private drains, failure to manage runoff per HOA standards. It was always someone else's fault. Never once did Karen or her crew acknowledge that dumping concrete into the natural drainage path had broken the neighborhood's ability to handle water. It was as if the creek had never existed, wiped clean from memory like a footprint at a crime scene. I didn't argue. I kept quiet at the meetings, sat in the back, nodded politely, while they projected satellite images with red circles highlighting problem areas, and watched them pass emergency rules requiring mandatory drainage inspections for a convenient $250 per home. I played along. On the surface, I was the picture of compliance. Behind the scenes, I was collecting everything. Every storm became an opportunity. I walked the neighborhood with my old Nikon slung around my neck, playing the part of a hobbyist, while quietly photographing the aftermath: flooded lawns, submerged mailboxes, water pooling where it never had before. I kept a detailed notebook: dates, times, addresses, notes on which homes got hit hardest and how the water moved, or didn't. After heavy rains, I launched my old drone to capture aerial shots showing the bigger picture, where the water pooled, how it spread. No one paid much attention. Most were too busy pointing fingers as the flooding got worse. So did the neighborly trust. Mrs. Jensen blamed the Alvarez kids for blocking a drain with a soccer ball. The Hendersons said the Patels' new flower bed rerouted runoff into their yard. People who once shared beers over backyard grills were now filing complaints against each other for water sabotage. And the HOA. They leaned right into the chaos. Karen got herself appointed head of a brand-new flood mitigation task force, which mostly meant sending out more threatening letters and rubber-stamping new fines. No votes, no discussion. Meanwhile, the actual infrastructure fell apart. The few storm drains we had weren't designed to carry the full burden without help from the creek. They backed up under the pressure, overwhelmed, gasping like a man trying to breathe through a straw. Pavement split. Sod slid away. Mold crept, like ivy up garage doors. Yet somehow, every time, the blame looped back to the residents. I overheard one guy mutter at the mailbox that Karen ought to fine herself for failing to control the weather. The sarcasm was getting thicker than the runoff. I didn't respond, just gave him a knowing nod and tucked another set of photos into my ever-growing file. It wasn't just the water that was rising. It was the resentment, too, thick and festering, building pressure beneath the manicured lawns and painted fences like steam under a cracked kettle lid. You could feel it everywhere, in the way neighbors avoided eye contact at HOA meetings, in the way hushed conversations abruptly died when certain board members walked by. And Karen thrived on it. She strutted around with her HOA badge, like it was a sheriff's star, basking in every new complaint she filed, every fine she handed down like a sentence from a petty throne. She even made a personal visit to my door one humid afternoon, wearing that tight-lipped smile that never touched her eyes. She informed me with mock sweetness that due to ongoing drainage issues, I was now required to submit a full landscaping plan for review by month's end. I asked if that plan should include the unauthorized concrete barrier they'd dumped into my yard, but she just blinked slowly and reminded me that modifying existing drainage structures without approval could result in additional fines. I took the official-looking form with a smile, thanked her kindly, and slid it straight into my binder, my thick, well-organized, quietly damning binder. Let them dig their own hole. I had patience, I had time, and I understood something none of them did. Nature doesn't forget, water doesn't forgive, and concrete, smug, gray, and heavy, has no defense against the quiet, relentless power of rain and gravity. The damage was already starting to show for those who knew where to look. Mr. Alvarez's retaining wall was sinking inch by inch. The base of the Hendersons' driveway had become a permanent puddle, fed by every storm and never quite drying. Out, and Mrs. Jensen's front yard? It had begun to tilt ever so slightly toward the street, a subtle slump only visible if you stood at just the right angle. The land was shifting, slowly, quietly, like something waking up, all because they tried to smother a living thing with cement. So I stayed quiet. I watched. I kept my mouth shut and my camera batteries charged because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was happening to all of us. And when the dam broke, when the truth finally forced its way through, I was going to be there with a front row seat and all the receipts. The third week of rain came on like a drum roll, soft at first, a whisper of drops tapping the glass. Then it gathered strength, rising into a full-throated roar that swallowed the sky, turning everything black and heavy with the scent of wet earth and ozone. The weather reports were unanimous. A 100-year storm, a freak convergence of cold fronts, saturated soil, and sheer, unrelenting force. She handed me that monstrous stack of accusations like she was delivering a royal decree, standing in her soaked designer flats, mascara bleeding slightly at the edges, still pretending she had control over any of this. I didn't flinch. I didn't yell. I just took the notice, flipped through the pages slowly, letting the ink bleed a little from my wet fingers, and smiled. Not the smug kind of smile she was used to. This one was calm, quiet. I thanked her for the delivery, told her she might want to move her car before the water reached the exhaust, and gently closed the door. Inside, I added the violation to the binder. It was getting heavy now, too thick for the little desk drawer I'd been keeping it in. Each photo, each time-stamped note, every satellite printout and drainage map folded neatly in plastic sleeves. And at the top of the pile, the land survey and county codes highlighting the designation of the creek as a protected natural drainage channel, untouchable, legally immutable, until they poured concrete into it without a permit. The funny thing about arrogance is it always forgets to check the fine print. I had already spoken with someone at the county water management office. I'd already started drafting the formal complaint. What Karen didn't know, what she refused to believe, was that her war with nature had broken more than just pipes and sidewalks. It had broken actual law, and not just HOA guidelines or neighborhood policies, county, state, and environmental regulations, multiple agencies, multiple violations. The storm had turned the neighborhood into a swamp, but I had weathered it with dry feet and a camera roll full of truth. Karen's empire was sinking, literally and figuratively, and I was no longer the only one watching. Other neighbors had started coming to me quietly, asking questions, offering their own photos, their own stories, their own frustration. Turns out all it takes is one stubborn fool and a ruined creek to crack the facade. So, let her march. Let her scream and scribble and issue her pointless notices. The water had done its work. The land had made its point. And I was just getting started. Her voice shook with barely suppressed fury as she read the accusations, rain still dripping, from the hem of her expensive coat. I listened calmly, sipping my coffee, nodding in all the right places while she poured out every bit of her fear, frustration, and rage. I didn't sign anything. I barely spoke. I just gave her that slow, knowing smile that made her eyes narrow with suspicion because I held a truth she didn't, something I'd known for weeks. I'd been sitting quietly on it like a trapdoor spider, waiting for the perfect moment. They thought they could erase the creek with a stretch of concrete and a stack of paperwork. But real creeks don't vanish so easily. They are carved into the land's memory, deeper than any human-made boundary or HOA regulation. The water hadn't disappeared. It had simply gone underground, threading through the earth, creeping along its old channels, saturating the soil until the damage became undeniable. The cracks in the foundations weren't just from blocked drains or heavy rain. The ground itself was shifting, swollen with hidden water, pushing back against the foolish constraints placed on it. And I had evidence. Drone images capturing the first signs of pooling, aerial maps tracing the water's steady encroachment toward the vulnerable homes, outdated floodplain charts ignored by the HOA after their illegal modifications. I'd even recorded hushed conversations with contractors and surveyors who admitted, off the record, that the changes violated county drainage laws. But I wasn't ready to reveal my hand. Not yet. It needed to get worse. It needed to cause real pain. It needed to break them. And from the rising tension in the neighborhood, I could tell we were close. You could feel it in the air, like the charge before a storm, in the way neighbors stared each other down over flooded walkways, in the sharp voices that cut through HOA meetings, in the sagging lawns heavy with mud and bitterness. Karen felt it too. She responded with tighter control, new rules, more fines, surprise inspections. She launched a neighborhood improvement committee to root out properties she claimed were dragging down the community's image. And whose name topped that list? Mine. I chuckled when I got the notice. 3 pages of vague complaints and barely disguised threats. I filed it in my binder and tucked a copy into the waterproof box buried beneath the old oak tree out back. Because people like Karen, once they feel the ground crumbling beneath them, start making desperate decisions. And desperate people make big mistakes. All I had to do was wait. The land would take care of the rest. The signs were already there, plain as day. Entryways that once stood proud were starting to sag. Fences leaned at odd angles, retaining walls split down their seams. You could hear it in the uneasy conversations at the coffee shop, in the hushed exchanges by the mailboxes, and see it in the flurry of for-sale signs sprouting up like mushrooms after a storm. The neighborhood was decaying from the inside out, collapsing under the weight of Karen's brittle kingdom of bylaws and penalties. And still she believed she could strong-arm her way back to control by fining me into silence. She thought it was personal. That was her mistake. This wasn't about me. It was about the land, the water, and the kind of elemental force that doesn't care about politics or paperwork. Forces older than any HOA charter and far more patient. And Karen was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The heavy envelope had been buried in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet for years, wedged between crumbling manuals and a dusty box of tangled Christmas lights I never got around to hanging. I unearthed it the night after Karen smugly delivered her latest violation notice, her self-satisfied smirk still etched in my memory. Stubbornness sent me to the garage that night, flashlight clenched between my teeth as I dug through forgotten boxes. That's when I found the battered blue folder my grandfather had handed me when he signed the property over. "What might come in handy one day," he'd said, and never offered more. I cracked the envelope open with the edge of a screwdriver and spread the contents across the floor. It was a gold mine. Original land surveys dated 1952, a certified letter from the County Water Authority, stamped 1978, confirming a permanent natural drainage easement cutting right through what was now my backyard. copies of state environmental rulings designating the creek as part of a protected watershed. Ironclad evidence that my little creek wasn't just decorative, it was a legally recognized waterway. One no HOA, no matter how power-drunk, had any. Right to bury, reroute, or obstruct. But that's exactly what they'd done when they poured concrete over it. I sat back on the cold garage floor, documents fanned out like aces in a gambler's hand, and exhaled slowly. They'd made a serious mistake. But waving papers around at a community meeting wouldn't be enough. I needed the right eyes on them, inspectors, regulators, people who could bring the hammer down. So I started making calls. The first was to the County Water Authority, citing concerns over unauthorized alterations to a natural drainage system. Next, the city's environmental office, framed as a potential wetland violation. I gave my real name, my real property info, but didn't mention the HOA. Better to let the officials connect those dots themselves. While the machinery of bureaucracy started grinding forward, I turned to phase 2 of the plan, anonymous whistleblowing. It was easier than I expected. A burner email, a carefully worded message outlining the situation, and a package of damning attachments, aerial drone footage, time-stamped photos of the concrete pour, scanned copies of the old easement documents, and direct links to the relevant county codes they'd violated. I sent it everywhere, local news stations, the city paper, a few popular suburban Facebook groups, and for good measure, the HOA gossip forum that Karen had banned me from last year. Then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, a white county truck crept down the street, followed closely by a second vehicle bearing the city seal. 2 inspectors stepped out, one with a clipboard, the other with a surveyor's tripod, and made their way across the muddy sidewalk, careful not to step into the flooded yards. They came straight to my door. I welcomed them in, offered coffee, and calmly laid out the entire timeline, presenting my evidence piece by piece with the kind of steady confidence that paper can't fake. They asked a few sharp questions, nodded a lot, and then spent the next 4 hours combing the property. They measured the depth of the concrete, took soil samples, snapped photos from every possible angle. I watched from the porch as they worked, conferring in low voices, frowning, more with each passing minute. When they finally left, they shook their heads and drove off in silence. That night, the story broke. It was just a short spot on the evening news, but it hit hard. A grainy aerial shot of the neighborhood, half submerged in muddy water, while the reporter explained how illegal modifications to a natural drainage system may have worsened flooding and triggered multiple environmental violations. They didn't name the HOA yet, but that wouldn't last. The next morning, I pulled a certified letter from the mailbox, an official notice of investigation addressed to the HOA. Not that Karen needed the reminder. The way she stormed into my emergency board meeting said it all. I showed up just long enough to watch the show. She marched up to the podium like a thundercloud, cheeks flushed, hair frizzing wildly from the rain, and slammed a thick folder of papers down in front of the stunned board members. She raged about slander, false accusations, rogue residents, trying to undermine the community. She blamed the county for overreach, the city for corruption, the media for bias, everyone but herself. Then the projector lit up behind her, displaying images pulled straight from the whistleblower file. A photo of a concrete truck pouring into the old creek bed. A highlighted map showing the easement cutting directly through my yard. Screenshots of the violated county codes in glaring red text. The room went utterly silent, the only sound the soft whir of the air conditioning. Even the board, usually quick to nod along with whatever Karen said, sat frozen, eyes darting anywhere but at her. They knew. Everyone in that room knew. She was cornered, and she knew it. But Karen was nothing if not relentless. She pushed back hard, claiming the concrete was just a temporary erosion control solution, arguing that the HOA had every right to beautify common areas. She even hinted that someone at the county had given her verbal permission for the improvements. But when one of the quieter board members cautiously asked if she had that permission in writing, her jaw snapped shut, like a bear trap. She had nothing, and everyone in the room could see it. That night, the second round of news coverage landed, and it wasn't soft. The tone had sharpened. Words like illegal, reckless, and civil and criminal liability were spoken with clear intent. Several residents gave interviews, some on camera, venting their anger and anxiety. Concerns about property values, toxic mold, and shifting foundations echoed through the segments. A local environmental watchdog group jumped on the story, launching a petition demanding a full-scale investigation and compensation for affected homeowners. Within the week, the county posted violation notices on the doors of the community center. City inspectors began knocking, but not with HOA citations. This time, they were there to inspect water damage and structural integrity. Lawsuits began forming in the shadows. Word spread quickly that several homeowners were preparing to sue the HOA, and even specific board members, for gross negligence and property damage. At the eye of the storm stood Karen, frantically trying to patch holes in a ship that was already taking on water. She tried rallying her last few loyalists, the rule-bound true believers who still clung to her vision of strict community order. But their numbers thinned with each flooded basement and each new crack in a wall. She tried to flip the script, claimed she was the victim of a coordinated smear campaign, floated theories of sabotage, but the crowd wasn't buying it anymore. The neighbors who used to nod along with her lectures now crossed the street to avoid her. Board meetings that once buzzed with petty authority now struggled to gather enough warm bodies to make quorum. Her empire was unraveling, and she had no idea how to stop the bleed. I watched it all from my porch, coffee in hand, flipping through news clippings and printed emails like a man reading a long-awaited epilogue. Karen may have once had the neighborhood in her grip, but now it was the city, the county, the press, and the law pulling her down inch by inch. She had built her reign on arrogance and concrete, poured her certainty into a foundation that could never hold, and in doing so, she forgot the simplest truth of all: nature always wins. This time, it was going to win with a vengeance. The first round of city-issued citations hit like thunder. Thick envelopes stuffed into every HOA board member's mailbox, each stamped with the unflinching authority of legal language and municipal wrath. I would have paid good money to see Karen's expression when she opened hers. But the real reckoning came later that day, when red tags started appearing on doors up and down the block, 12 homes in total, including Karen's: unsafe structure, unstable foundation, immediate occupancy restricted pending remediation. In plain terms, their dream homes had just been declared unfit for living. I sat on my porch and watched as families stood dumbstruck in the rain, staring at the bright orange. Warning placards as if they couldn't quite comprehend what they were seeing. Within days, moving vans began to clog the streets, their engines growling under the weight of hastily packed boxes and furniture. Bewildered homeowners moved in a daze, trying to salvage pieces of their lives from houses that were slowly sinking into the earth like ghost ships swallowed by a patient sea. Karen, true to form, tried to fight it. She hired an attorney, threatened lawsuits against the city, screamed at the inspectors from her driveway until her voice gave out. But none of it mattered. The damage was undeniable. The evidence, too, clear. The trail of negligence too long and damning to bury. The final blow came from the insurance companies. As claims poured in for structural damage, mold, and foundation collapse, the adjusters descended like vultures. Their verdict was swift and merciless: act of negligence, policy violations, failure to maintain essential drainage. Denied. 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 With no payouts to fund repairs, homeowners were stranded, trapped in worthless properties, bleeding, money on mortgages for homes deemed unsafe. Foreclosure notices began appearing in windows like pale fluttering flags of surrender. Even Karen's own house, once the neighborhood's gleaming centerpiece with its trimmed hedges and imitation Greek columns, was condemned outright. By the end of the month, she was living in a borrowed RV parked at the far edge of the development, the tires slowly vanishing into the same muck she had unleashed. The HOA didn't last much longer. At a final emergency meeting, held in the dim, echoing shell of the community center, the last few residents voted to dissolve the organization entirely. No arguments, no ceremonies, just a weary show of hands raised in the drizzle. Karen tried to protest, but no one even acknowledged her. She was a ghost in her own court. The treasurer read the final financial statement in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. Over $2.3 million in projected legal liabilities, 0 assets. Bankruptcy inevitable. A motion was made, seconded, and passed without hesitation. Effective immediately, the HOA was no more. Karen was last seen dragging boxes of shredded paperwork out of the community center under the watchful eye of a city marshal, her legacy reduced to a few damp files and a community in ruins. But that wasn't the end. The death of the HOA left behind a question: rebuild the system the old way or return to the wisdom of the land? When the vote came, nearly everyone agreed. It was time to restore what had always been there. The county's environmental office stepped in with grants and support for watershed rehabilitation. Volunteers poured in. Even some of the displaced residents, once cold and dismissive, returned to help. For weeks, we dug and planted and shaped the earth with our hands. We peeled back the concrete, exposing the thirsty soil beneath. We redirected the water not with pipes and pumps, but with willows, native grasses, and carefully laid stones. We didn't fight the creek this time. We followed it. We listened. And slowly, the land began to heal. The first time the creek flowed again, clear, cold, and laughing through my backyard, it felt like an old friend calling my name after years of silence. I sat by its edge, feet dangling in the rushing current, and smiled as dragonflies darted over the water. Frogs croaked from the reeds, and the whole place seemed to breathe, the land letting out a long, contented sigh. But I wasn't done yet. On a bright morning, while the neighborhood buzzed with the sounds of rebuilding and fresh beginnings, I carried a small wooden sign to the head of the creek where it curled into my property. I'd carved it myself, each letter etched slowly and deliberately with my whittling knife, until the words stood clear and sharp for anyone to read. Nature always wins. It wasn't meant to gloat. It wasn't spite. It was truth. For all the rules they wrote, all the fines they handed out, all the concrete they poured in arrogance, they'd forgotten the oldest law of all, that no matter how high the walls, how official the stamps, how thick the bureaucracy, the land cannot be conquered forever. It remembers, it waits, and when the time is right, it reclaims what is its own. Karen left not long after. No tearful farewells, no speeches, no goodbyes. Just her battered RV hitching behind a rusted truck, wobbling. Down the street past peeling fences and sunken lawns. A few curious glances followed her. Mostly, there were sighs of relief. The house she once ruled from like a throne stood silent now, half sunken into the swamp she helped summon, its windows blank and lifeless, a monument to pride and failure. The new families who moved in didn't ask many questions. They saw the creek, the thriving trees, the hum of bees and the wildflowers, the way the land seemed to hum with quiet peace. That was enough for them. They let the land tell its own story, a better one, lasting and true. Sometimes I still sit by the water, watching it tumble over the stones, hearing the frogs as dusk falls, feeling the firm earth beneath me. I run my fingers over the weathered sign and smile, because I know what it cost to win this quiet corner. I know that no matter what comes, no matter who tries to tame it again, The land will outlast them. It will remember, and when the time is right, it will rise again, just like it always has.